Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining SailPoint's Meeting the Challenges of GDPR webinar. I'm Louise Harkness, and I'll be your moderator today. Joining me is John Waters, who is our technical sales specialist. Just before we start, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. So all participants will be placed on mute during the presentation, but if you do have questions, then please submit them using the Q&A panel. And we'll answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, and we will email you a link of the recorded version after the event. So thanks for joining us, and I will now hand you over to John Waters.
Thank you, Louise, for that warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. Louise, just to confirm, you can hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So my name is John Waters. I'm an overlay with the European and EMEA teams. I work with partners and our teams on several areas of subject matter expertise, and I have the privilege to present to you today the topic of GDPR. Before we get started, a couple of points I'd like to bring out. So number one, this is not a legal consultation, an exhaustive legal consultation around GDPR. We have done some extensive work with our partners and customers around the area of GDPR. So, the content of this presentation is to be very concrete about where and how we're helping organizations to get ready for GDPR in both, as it's coming forward, but also in sustainable ways for the future. And also, we do not claim to be some kind of a silver bullet that will solve every single topic of GDPR. That doesn't exist. Again, we've done an extensive study, so we're going to be very pragmatic and practical about this. And the essence of today's session is to give you a schematic overview of how SailPoint is an important component moving forward towards GDPR compliance and indeed other regulations associated. So very briefly, we've been asked to take a very quick view again of GDPR. So this is not going to be an exhaustive delve into the regulation. We're making an assumption that you, like ourselves, have seen lots of presentations and data privacy professionals to advisory organizations to understand what the content is all about. This is also not about generating fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Again, we're going to stick to some pragmatic, schematic overview of how we can help. We're going to give an overview of some of the areas of technology, some of the areas where organizations have identified where they're going to need to use technology to address. And then we're going to, home in on what we can do with identity and access governance in conjunction, across all data environments and cloud applications, and how that makes, addresses a lot of the key challenges around GDPR. We'll talk about it in five key steps. But also link those steps to specific articles. Again, without going into a deep detail about the articles themselves, we can do that in subsequent sessions. Again, this is to give you a schematic overview of how organizations are addressing that. So again, a GDPR overview, again, we're not going to go into, it's a business enabler, right? So it's about, similar to a lot of different initiatives across the European Union. It's about creating a homogeneous data privacy law for EU citizen data to cut out a lot of the bureaucracy that has been evolving over time. Two main points here, I guess, is to talk about the scope. I think there's a lot of awareness that this is about EU citizen information, protecting their privacy rights, no matter where that information is stored around the world. But it also applies to non-EU citizens whose information is stored in European environments. And also, it entails, it covers machine information which can be traced to citizens. So that could be things like IP address, but also the onset of Internet of Things means a lot more of that needs to be, controls around that information need to be implemented. Again, So sanctions and litigation risk. So, we've all seen the numbers around this and what this entails, but again, talking to a lot of privacy experts and going through the history of how this regulation has been built. It's been first proposed to Parliament in 2012, but it goes back a lot further. And one of the key areas that took a lot of negotiation was around the sanctions, and they've been agreed. That's been punitive, but are also very reasonable and very doable. The legislation is not here to punish organisations, but to enable business going forward. And privacy by design and default, that means understanding where are my gaps today in my process around personal information, and what do I need to do to fill those gaps. And everything going forward after that, the so-called data controller has the task to make sure that GDPR is considered in any kind of design or application or the projects and people, process, technology going forward. Needs to be considered. And finally, we'll talk in a few minutes about the different personas who are specifically stipulated in there. So it's just a kind of a very high-level, light introduction to GDPR without going into too much detail. So GDPR itself, and privacy experts are consistently saying this is a legal requirement, and indeed, if you look at the law, the regulation, and it's good to read because it's actually written very much in layman's terms, and that's very much at the core of the idea. The vast majority of the clause around legalities and things like contracts with partners and vendors, etc., are what organisations are working on today. There's a lot about process in there and documentation, and indeed it's often been mentioned things like building on PCI DSS process, or building on ISO standards such as 27001 if they're already in place. To look at that and use that as a platform to move forward to getting compliant with GDPR. But also there's areas where technology is involved, and we summarize these very, very briefly here in these 7 different sections, which we just quickly flick through. Some people talk about consent, right? So consent is often today, kind of legal disclaimers with hidden check boxes already ticked and stuff like that. But what they're requiring here is a harder opt-in, so that the data subject, the person whose data privacy we're protecting, needs to really understand what they're consenting their data to be used for, and they need to be, there's no such thing as automatic check boxes anymore. But also, conversely, they need to be able to come back and be able to say, right, I want to opt out again, stop using my information. My consent has been here withdrawn. So this is something that organizations will need to work on the process to get. The breach notification and detection. Now, this does not yet exist in European privacy laws. It exists in the majority of the United States privacy laws. But in none of the European. So it's a very, very interesting one. It's one that it's challenging, but it's also doable. It's very sensible to do, obviously, from a privacy point of view, so that people can react to data breaches very, very quickly and stop subsequent fraudulent behavior. But also, when you start to get this right for personal information, start to get this right for your own intellectual property, and we're not talking just about the very, very highly sensitive intellectual property. We're talking about things like even pricing information and that kind of stuff. That can result in under the radar hemorrhaging of information. So this is a good thing for organizations to start to get really good at, to reduce the time it takes to be able to intervene should and when a breach occur. The right to access is, basically the subject's right to say to the organization, I'd like to have a copy of all my data, and there's a 30-day turnaround time. And similarly, the right to be forgotten is also, please remove my data. Now, that doesn't just mean, hitting the delete button. It also means, making sure that down in the machine level that information is removed. Data portability, just using an example here. Now I'm changing my bank. I want to move to another online bank. This is not a copy paste. This is a cut and paste. Remove my information and pass it on to the next guy. And privacy by design. So it is a very sensible approach to make sure that data controllers are influencing projects to do with going forward with people, process, and technology to make sure that privacy is considered in those, to first get further controls around information, personal information, but also to make sure that the good work that's been done does not get undone. And then the personas. So the DPO has that job to interpret the regulation, conduct impact analysis, and communicate that within the organization, what needs to be done. but also, additionally in this case, has the task to make sure to oversee that the steps are taken to manage that information. Data controller has the hands-on role to, particularly around the privacy by design. So we'll talk a little bit more about the role of the data controller. And interesting, the data processor, the person actually using information, all the way out to the outer edges of the organization, has some degree of liability in the regulation. So, one of the key areas that organizations are focusing on is how do we get that awareness out into the outer areas of the organization. And we believe this is something that we certainly can help with. And the data subject is the person affected by, the actual citizen, the European citizen or non-European, but used in European information systems. So that's a brief introduction overview. What we're going to do is break this down into three, let's call them macro areas of where technology is going to be required to implement sustainable compliance to personal information. So, the top part is about identifying which processes use personal information and understand these processes relative to what's requirement. So how do I collect consent today? How does that need to look going forward? What's the gap analysis in those processes? And then to start to design and implement those processes, on an application layer to make sure that, I can manage that data privacy requirement throughout the process. So again, data privacy is as against security, data privacy is the continuous management of that information throughout its life cycle, so that I'm using that information correctly. And security is a subset of that, a very important subset of that, making sure that that information is secure. So we have a big contribution to make on that upper layer, but in essence, mainly we're going to focus on the governance and security of that information during today's session. So before we go into details, I want to take a little bit of a step back and look at that old adage of, being able to, a little bit about my background myself. I worked in the area of business process management and consulting, and I worked in the area of business process management and consulting, and I just want to have one moment, please. I'm just after getting. I just got a message. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, I just received a message there that somebody couldn't see my screen, so I just wanted to make sure. Thank you. Sorry for that brief interruption. Okay, so working in the area of business process integration. So at the end of the day, business is always here to make money, tap into new markets, and tap into new layers of efficiency. We see a lot in the world of digital transformation, where there's a greater integration of externals and consultants and an ecosystem of partners in this environment. And sometimes it's a kind of a catch-22. So how do I grow my business while I'm keeping my data more and more secure? And there are many examples of where that reaching that compliance, those levels of compliance, whilst growing the business is often in direct conflict. And we believe we've got a very, very big contribution here because we're very, very business-centric technology provider. And our technology is designed to enable business. So we make that a little bit more clear in this slide, where we see, some of the challenges that, in the past, the perimeter security meant that information was pretty much secure within organizations, or it was felt that it was very much secure. It was an absolute necessity. And where it's still a necessity, it's no longer enough. We've got evolving organizations with that ecosystem of employees, vendors, partners, contractors, etc. You've got things like divestiture and merger and acquisition going forward. You get a lot of virtual organizations be built to work on individual projects, and these organizations get disbanded afterwards. So there's huge levels of integration that are required. So when we peel back the layers here on, say, for example, employees, vendors, partners, contractors, etc., we start to ask ourselves, who are the individuals, right? What do we know about these individuals? Let's get down to the biological person. and understand who these are relative to their business requirement. And that's where we come into the word identity. So understanding from various points of view with regards to business roles within an organization who these individuals are, to be able to understand what kind of permissions these individuals should have to information. So this is why we term, we're weaving the identity governance into the fabric of organization security, and obviously governance is a key word here, right? So to make sure that the right people have the right access to the right personal information within the process and within the data stores within the organization, and to ensure that that is the decision making and the visibility around that those structures are in the right hands of the right people. So as I mentioned earlier, the data controller has a specific task to design that orchestration of people, process, and technology. And that's to make sure that the responsibility is adhered to, is reached out into the business for making sure that this data is secure at all time. And we talked about the data processors. These guys have got that liability, so we'd like to reach out to those guys and help them to gain more awareness of the threats in place, but also give them a lot more controls and visibility with regards to the information that they're protecting. So this is a very nice summary. I like this very much. This is again been defined in conjunction with our partners and our studies into where we can help. So there's three pillars, I guess. Assessing risk and ongoing assessment of risk. So we've seen organizations are constantly changing. Hence, the risk landscape is constantly changing. The threats are constantly changing. So we need to constantly understand what's going on within our systems relative to what's required. And as things move, to start to highlight risks and then strengthen controls around them. But let's always make that assumption that something does go wrong, that there's a disgruntled employee within the organization, that there's some very clever hacker out there that manages to get his hands on stuff. So we need to automate detection to feed back into the 72-hour requirement. So we're going to go in now into 5 steps about how we do that, how we help organizations to achieve that. And these 5 steps are going to be related into one or several articles within the GDPR requirement to give you that correlation between what we do and how we help organizations to become compliant with GDPR. Before we do that, just to make that plausible, now this is not a product or a technology presentation, but I'd just like to give you a quick overview of what our technology platform looks like at that stage, to make it a lot more, so you can understand in more detail as to the 5 subsequent points we want to talk about. Compliance controls, really, basically that's a question of deciding or implementing how it should be based upon the GDPR requirements. So the GDPR requirements tells us what the regulation requires, and we can translate that into, who should have access to which information, and put the workflows and policies in place to ensure that that is adhered to. And then the life cycle management is high levels of automation of this very, very dynamic landscape of people coming and going and moving across the organizations, externals and internals, etc. So that's constantly moving. When you've got thousands or tens of thousands of employees within your organization, this landscape is moving across every day, every minute, every hour of every day. So this requires high levels of automation. So this is the automating what should be done. So we're constantly staying in line with the desired state. And password management. So one of the biggest threats is that when people get their hands on credentials and use them, it makes it with the password management. Obviously, we do 2 things. We ensure that there's a certain level of sophistication and complexity with passwords, but also that they are there for a finite period of time. And time is important because a data breach is not a smash and grab job. Good data thieves tend to be in organizations for a long time to land and expand. So, if they do manage to get their hands on those very, very, very few credentials now at this stage, they can get access to information, and that these credentials are not live forever, that the password will be reset at some stage going forward. Data access governance. So SailPoint is a unique organization that basically answers the question of the market. So we've got the same user, we've got the same data, we've got the same threats, and we've got the same regulations. Can we get the same controls across the entire environment? And this is where data access governance comes in. We're talking about the unstructured data environment, your Excel files, your PDFs, your file shares, your SharePoint sites, your cloud environments. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that specific area going forward, but definitely we reach out into the structured and unstructured data environment. And the identity analytics enables the seeing a lot more about the organization, understanding as threats evolve, as the organizations evolve, and getting a lot more intelligence to the life within the organizations to be able to feed that back into compliance controls as and when risks occur. We said at the beginning, we're not saying here we're the silver bullet. We're giving you a clear illustration here as to how we can help in a logical way. So we have our open identity platform, which is enabling the collaboration and integration with other environments such as CM systems and such as privileged account management systems, but also the strong synergy that we would have with systems such as data leakage prevention, etc. All applications, on-prem, cloud, structured data, unstructured data, and third-party integration. So very, very holistic, this end-to-end control around permissions and data, and keeping the identity aligned with the data at any one time. So now, the 5 steps, right? So, how people process information. So get management around information, get management around the permissions, secure that data, monitor and detect, and then document that and feed that into the organization. That really is, in a nutshell, what organizations need to be doing. We'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one, how organizations process and store data. So again, this is stipulated in the contract, in the requirement, keeping instances of personal data to an absolute minimum and avoid things like unlawful use of that information or loss or destruction of that information. If it's not there, if I can't access, I can't steal it, I can't destroy it, I can't do something else with it. Minimize the collection of information. Now this starts with the policies, but also we'll see in a few minutes that one of the problematic areas is people actually duplicating and creating many copies of that information out in the business side in the unstructured data environments. And keeping permissions to that information and the data itself down to an absolute minimum in terms of it needs to be relevant to specific business process. And in line with the consent of the data subject. So how we can do that, and this is the format of going through these steps. We talk a little bit about the requirement, and then we talk about how we can help there. So one of the first things is understanding. Obviously we said we're understanding process and which data is being used and collected and where it's being collected, but also being able to discover this information in, say, for example, areas such as file share. So SharePoint sites, cloud storage information. So understand, where is this information? Who's got access to this information? Put that virtual layer on top of that and ask that question. Who's got access to this information based upon their business role? And I think, what I'm saying very often, that it's very, very interesting to see how much of this information is exposed to absolutely surplus access permissions on there. And start to look at that information, see what's actually happening, and who's touching that information, who's generating that information. I will talk in a second about how that is important also for understanding the process within your organization. And then protect it. Obviously, I think that one of the most obvious ones here is to be able to implement policies and see, okay, when you find certain types of information in certain locations, to move it into more secure quarantine for further notice, right? So again, when we look at file shares and SharePoint sites at this stage, I think everybody will acknowledge that we'll talk in a while about this, this feedback from the market is one of the biggest concerns, is that this information is strewn across those environments in multiples of files, multiple locations. So, one of the first steps is to start to work on reducing the quantity of that information, both out there, but also obviously in structured data environments as you gain a further understanding. So you're lowering the attack surface, right? So things can't go wrong. So this is just a very simple kind of showcase screenshot. There's a lot more behind this, but this shows you the levels of transparency and the simplicity of the transparency. This is a data owner, can see, relative to the aging of certain types of information, where that information is stored, and like I say, in the background, you've got a lot of process in place where you can automatically manage that information, for example, move that information into more secure quarantine. We're reluctant to delete any kind of information automatically because of the deletion requirements and concerns about false positives around that information. But moving into much more storage, much more secure storage, and that's really privacy by design, right? That contributing to privacy by design to make sure that information is only where it should be. So the second stage is fine-grained access control. So to make sure it's only accessible to people who should have access to that information. It's a very simple motto. That data cannot be misused, cannot be stolen, cannot be destroyed by people if they don't have access to that, right? So if we keep that down to an absolute minimum relative to the business requirements, business roles of the individual, we've drastically reduced the probability of anything going wrong in accordance with the requirements. So in Article 25, this is also linked on, and that people have personal data accessed selectively and only for a defined purpose. Then we get a fine-grained visibility improves accessing personal information, and there's an adequate governance structure. So this is about making sure that the controls and the decision-making around who's got access to information is in the right hands. The people out in the business that have that intrinsic knowledge about the sensitivity of this information, that it's, by May next year, it will be in their hearts to keep that information secure. So give them the control to make sure that, give them the transparency and control to make sure that information is secure. So, again, the role-based access control, making sure based upon this highly powerful identity approach, what we call identity cube, which, talking about lots of different attributes about the vendor, the partner, the employee, the status of the employee, the different types of people that have access to information networks, and to make sure that the policies can be very simply created around that, bringing that in. So identity and role-based to make sure that the right people have the right access in accordance with the regulation. And then bring in those high levels of automation, and also start to understand where the risks are as and when they evolve. An absolute must is the ability to do recertification campaigns on personal information, from a compliance but also from a security point of view, to be able to really focus on those assets. So know the assets now containing that information. We can start to do a lot more recertification around that, so that we're continuously keeping tight controls around the access to that information. And I think granular data ownership is excellent. So you can see in our technology, we've got the ability to see activities and identities, and actually ask people who are using information, who's responsible for that information, collect that information, and go and speak to those guys, speak to the owners of that information, and give them the controls they need in order to get to manage the integrity of that information and keep the permissions down to an absolute minimum. And the enforcement of strong password policy is very important from fine-grained access control point of view. And again, some very simple screenshots. This is a tabular insight into from a data owner perspective, and all you have to do is click on approve or reject, to determine which permissions can be kept and which can be removed. You can use different parameters to say, let's look at this in a graphical way. So who should have access to my information? Which department should have access to my information, for example, and then see this illustrated in a graphical way, and start to bulk remove or revoke permissions that don't correspond to his requirements. And also looking at individual recertification, you can see that this is a person, we're looking at their holistic permissions across the organization, but we can also see that they're a member of a group which gives them access to personal information up in a file share. And I think this is really, really, it's an amazingly simple for the business user to deal with this. And what's really, this is like recertification, but even if we look at this one, this is really amazing. So that when somebody's requesting access to permission, to a certain type of permission, that, a policy violation is detected, that this permission would give this person who's an external employee access to sensitive personal information in a file share. And that's very, very powerful, and it's made in a very simple way for the business user to make very controlled decisions around who should have access to information. So, securing personal data, this is very much around the data protection by design and default. So, getting those end-to-end process in place to make sure that the data controller is constantly working on those projects with the, for example, systems, process re-engineering, and also governance structures within the organization to make sure that the data protection or the GDPR requirements are considered in all those activities going forward. And one of the key requirements there is to be able to do an ongoing data privacy impact assessment, which we have a big contribution to. But also to demonstrate there's a lot of strong controls around personal data, and to be able to demonstrate that in the impact assessment. So when the authorities do come along and knock on the door and they'd like to see, what's your current impact assessment, that this can be produced very, very quickly, based upon permissions and data, and to show that there's a lot of process in place to make sure that this data is kept under control. So obviously from a preventative point of view, the best thing to do is always prevent, right? So putting those policies in place, making sure that you've got your desired state defined relative to the GDPR regulation and highly automated fulfillment of that, to get great transparency, particularly into risks. So to create dashboards to understand where my risks are and to be able to focus more controls on that. Remember the assessment, control, and detection. And obviously we've seen in the SailPoint platform that there's the analytics section, which should give a lot more. There's state-of-the-art algorithms working constantly on this information to get a lot more intelligence out of there. And then demonstrate modern. To the authorities and also within the organization, that there's a lot of work being done to manage the permissions, and you can see that reflected in the activities around data to show that there's no little anomalies happening out there. And when there is an anomaly, that's detected in real time with highly automated process and the ability then to intervene and remediate. And obviously then you can build and schedule self-assessment, risk assessment, self-assessment reports for the compliance. So a very simple dashboard here again is, this is the data owner. He's got a specific resource, contains personal information, and he's decided, what are my risks associated with permissions on this in these environments, which of these environments contain my sensitive information, my classified information, personal information, and then to be able to see, if it's everything's in line with the policy that's been defined, or indeed if there's any kind of violation. And in this case, you can see that there's been a violation. You can drill down into that and revoke excess permissions to that data. Or indeed, if there's a need to make sure that this process is implemented to remove data from overexposed resources. So very, very simple and designed into the everyday process of the users within the organization. So now it only takes one, right? So there's no 100%. So sometimes you've got a disgruntled employee. You might have somebody that gets in there and starts to do stuff with information. Maybe there might be even some, reckless activities around information. So it's very important to be able to detect anomaly behavior and to understand who's accessing information, what's happening with this information relative to the regulation. So monitoring, detecting, that's stipulated and mentioned and referred to and implied in many different articles across the regulation. And what really stands out is the 72 hours. So as mentioned, no European privacy law has a a reporting deadline. So detect a breach, but also understand what records have been compromised. So a lot of analytics around that to be able to ultimately give the authorities and indeed the data subjects themselves that information within a very short period of time to limit damage, so that people can take measures to make sure that their information is not misused, and forensics obviously to help to understand where that breach has come from. So how we have there again, real-time detection, fine-grained monitor of information, of who's accessing which information based on a wide variety of identity attributes, but also when they're doing it, from where they're doing it. You might have a legitimate activity on there, but it's happening at 3 a.m., right? This may look strange. You might have a lot of activities at the same time, so this will show up, and you can say, right, let's have a further investigation in there. That looks like a breach. So those telltale signs will stand out from all the different activities that are happening in there. And obviously those policies that you can build around that, so whitelist, how should it be? Who should be accessing personal information, how and when? And warnings about what should not be happening to that information. So very simple. We build on who, where, when, what, and how, and understand, when these things occur, and be able to detect anomalies and in real time, and intervene obviously, and get that fine-grained reports about what records have been compromised, and understand have I been breached, and do some initial investigation into that, and be able to furnish that information to the authorities within a relatively short period of time. Whilst also being able to deliver forensics information to help them in their investigation, and then feed that back into your risk scoring assessment going forward, so that you constantly improve those controls as you move forward. So you get a lot of information about breaches. So it's always very, very important to understand when you've been breached how that happened, because these are doors and windows that are going to be closed moving forward. So again, we can see here a very simple snapshot of activities around personal information and human resource, and a very simple looking policy: who, where, when, what, and how. When a department is not equal to HR and they're doing some activities on personal information, you could put in there outside of the hours of say 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. they shouldn't be accessing that information, etc., etc. And then launch a series of alerts around that to say, this is something that looks a little bit suspicious, or this is absolutely an alert. This looks like it's a breach of information. We've recently published some material around ransomware attacks as well, which is also obviously in violation of GDPR. Should personal information be affected there as well, to be able to detect that based on file endings and be able to disable that user in real time. So very, very powerful, and that feeds in then to our fine-grained audit trail for showing that we've got everything under control. And then this is a very simple overview of how that process looks: an identity attribute, copies of file, the data owner gets an alert, or even the system itself gets an alert, the administrator gets an alert, and a remediation process is initiated, such as, in this case, for an example, an automatic revocation of a permission on them. So very, very, very powerful. And can be made very, very effective in the monitoring and detection of anomalies as and when they occur. And finally, and this is very briefly, it's all about the documentation. So it requires an organization to maintain an internal data processing registry to document all personal data processing activities. So we've seen that we've got a lot of information, fine-grained information around processing activities, personal information, which we can furnish back into this documentation requirement. So in essence, we've come to the end of those five steps, and I'm just going to close out in a few minutes. So step one, remove information, manage the personal information, keep it down to an absolute minimum, get the permissions to that information down to an absolute need-to-know basis, get stricter controls around that information to make sure that when that information is being touched in a bad way, and a way that violates the requirement, to understand that, to see that, and to be able to make sure that that is built into the process of the organization going forward. To be in a position to detect and report anomalies as and when they happen to understand, have I been breached really, really close to the time that it's happened, and that's a fantastic step towards damage limitation going forward. And finally, to make sure that I've got all that information which I can feed into my documentation requirements. So again, a very quick overview of the SailPoint platform, compliance controls, how it should be, lifecycle management, the realization of that in a highly automated way, making sure passwords are very, very difficult to break, but also are there on a temporary basis, as in they need to be renewed on a regular basis. We're going to go into the area of data access governance in a second very briefly, and then more analytics, which I can feed into my risk assessment going forward, and really tighten up my controls continuously across all applications, across all data, and highly integratable with other systems within your landscape. So one of the things we've been asked about on a regular basis with our advisory and the customers is the area around unstructured data. So very, very briefly, why they've kind of started to say this is an area that they're really concerned about now, and why they're looking to focus on this going forward at this stage is it's known. You've got hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of employees that are administering this information over many years. So this data is, very clearly exposed across those environments. And there's typically a permission chaos. So we can, with our data access governance module, give you the ability to get a more data and resource-centric permission model, get a lot more structure around that, get a lot more automation in there. Organizations are moving increasingly towards the cloud, so they like to keep the controls in-house while leveraging off the benefits of moving information into cloud environments. Get more data-centric permission modeling, and interesting is this ability to understand what's happening within my process. So you can see activities, identities, and understand who's generating information, who's touching that information based upon their role within the organization. And basically, this is providing fine-grained intelligence into that part of the assessments of understanding which process within organizations are actually using personal information. And the ability to get granular data ownership. This is a really nice feature is to combine identities and activities and ask those guys who's responsible for information. So again, just to close out with this very nice look at the pillars. So get a greater, understand the ongoing risk as the organization and the threats themselves evolve. Get much greater controls around that in line with the requirements, and automate detection so that this can be dealt with in a timely manner. So we're SailPoint Technologies. We are in the Gartner quadrant and in the Forrester Wave at the top right, which means that we've got the most, very strong innovation in our technology, the most innovative technology, but also technology that's very quickly deployed and very, very efficient in its operation. We have a 98% retention rate with our customers due to our customer success management organization, which also feeds back into our ability to innovate, because we're constantly listening to our customers and their requirements going forward. We've got 750 plus some of the largest enterprises globally as customers, and this is going very, very quickly. So you see 9 of the top 20 banks, highly regulated, so there's a lot of very, very strict controls around how banks are regulated. So there's very, very high demands around these areas. So we're certainly, very well represented in that sector. If you look at the pharmaceutical, at this moment in time, 6 of the top 15, that's on the increase. And again, you think of the regulation, but also think of the intellectual property that those people are, focused on protecting. And you can see 7 of 10 top retail brands, lots of highly sensitive information and lots of dynamic churn within those types of organizations to be able to, ensure that permissions are kept to an absolute minimum at any one time. So our partner landscape is very comprehensive. We're a partner organization. We develop software. We do have a professional services team to work together with our partners. on customer engagements. But first and foremost, we've got some of the most renowned partners in the space globally, as well as working with global systems integrators and the global advisory firms, with whom we've been doing a lot of work around GDPR today. And finally, some of our technology alliances. Again, we mentioned the open identity platform. It's very important to understand that we see ourselves as an important layer within an overall bigger scheme of things. And this is how we position ourselves, and we have a very, very expansive set of alliances with different and relevant technologies that are, where we can leverage off each other to help organizations go forward and to future-proof their investment in a variety of different interventions. So we move into the question and answer section.
So we've just had one question through, so thank you for that. And the question is, do you have a clear list of what SailPoint can do and cannot do?
So a playlist of what we can do and what cannot do.
That's correct.
Yeah, we do that in a more one-to-one type of consultation. Again, we focus really very much on what we can do, and also can refer to our technology alliances, which gives us, which implies what we directly cannot do, but can complete in terms of, bringing our alliances also to the table to show how we can add additional features to GDPR requirements. So what we don't specifically work on is areas around consent or deletion of information or the portability of information. These are processes that need to be built into the applications that are collecting information and processing that information further downstream. Our main focus is making sure that information is kept to a minimum, particularly around in the unstructured data environments, but also that the general permissions on information are kept to an absolute need-to-know basis, based upon the policies and our high levels of automation.
Thank you, John. One further question has also come in, which is, where do you start data governance?
So with data governance, data governance is a big word, right? So data governance deals with a lot of different things, such as how do marketing people manage data, what can they do and not do with information. Our focus is on data access governance and where that specific requirement starts. So the first thing is to understand what, we'll stick to the area of personal information. So what is personal information? And personal information is, obviously individual information about their healthcare, information about banking or credit card information, lots of different types of information. Social security information is a very important one. So what does this information look like generically, so discovering where that information is located across environments is a very important first step. And there's, which will help understand what process are using that information. So within our platform, we've got a repository of assets which identify a wide range of different personal information attributes within files. So, for example, you've got 28 social security numbers in Europe, and each of them has a specific type of structure, which is called a syntax, which we've created regular expressions for, which actually we can find that information hidden in files out in the, really out in the peripheral of, say, for example, a file share. Identify that, and that in combination with other types of personal information. So to get that heat map of where my information is stored, it would be an excellent way to understand, how do I move forward? What processor do I need to focus on? And how do I start to secure that, make sure that information is only available in very secure and relevant locations?
Great, thank you for that, John. So far, no further questions have come in. I would just like to reiterate that if you do have direct questions for us, then please do contact us either via telephone or on the email address that's on the screen at the moment. But if nobody has any other questions during this webinar, it just leaves me to thank you, John, for your time and for this fantastic presentation, and to remind everyone that you will receive a recorded version of the webinar via email. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely